welcome everyone. So what are we talking about today? Three major topics. So what are today's system design interviews like throughout the technical interview loop? And then what are the top ways to prepare for that interview? And then what are the best resources to prepare for that system design interview? So we're going to stop every once in a while for Q&A. And so if you do have questions, put them in the question section of the Zoom interface, preferably not in the chat because we'll see the questions in Q&A. And yes, there will be a recording of this webinar and it will be shared shortly after the webinar ends, and we'll send out in email with some links to additional resources. So we've got a lot of content to cover today, so let's go ahead and get started. All right. So for FAANG interview processes at FAANG, it's obviously at FAANG companies, but then in general for technical interview loops, Fahim, can you take us through what are the three categories of interviews that candidates are going to go through these days?
Yeah, so there are three basic categories of the interviews. The first is the cultural fit or the behavioral interview. The second is the coding interview, which is lead code style questions. And the third is the design interview. And we've seen that as companies have become more web scale companies, that design interview has gravitated more and more towards system design interview. You would still see some companies asking low-level design or object-oriented design as well, but primarily, if you're going for a FAANG company, you're most likely going to get a system design interview. So yeah, those are the three categories of interviews that are very common these days.
Okay. And so I know, I think most folks on this call are familiar with, with the system design interview, but perhaps for some people who are, say, newer to tech and development, why system design? Why is this topic so important with hiring managers?
Well, this is important because it tests your aptitude on how you can deliver products that can scale to millions or hundreds of millions of users. And that capability, those capabilities go beyond just the basic capabilities of you writing code. And you have a picture of what happened with Ticketmaster a few months ago, and we blogged about it as well. So when systems are not designed correctly, then your systems crash under heavy load. And so what engineering leaders are looking for is your aptitude and your ability. And obviously that changes based on how senior you are or how junior you are. But primarily, coding interview is the bare minimum that every software engineer needs to know. Now, the system design interview is typically an interview that describes or defines your level in the org. What I mean by that is that everybody has to pass lead code style coding interviews, but then the system design interview and your performance in that interview defines whether you are a junior engineer or a mid-level engineer or a senior engineer or a really senior engineer. Now, if you only have 1 year of experience and you do really well in those interviews, you're most likely not going to be up-leveled. But on the other hand, if you have 10 years of experience, but you perform poorly in a system design interview, you will most likely be down-leveled. So we see a lot of people, and especially a lot of mid-level engineers and senior engineers, go into these interviews and then perform poorly, and then they're unfortunately down-leveled. So in a way, I would say the system design interview is critical for the engineering leaders because they're looking for your ability to build scalable systems. And for you as an interviewer, it's important because this is the interview that is actually going to define the level that you're going to be hired on.
Okay, thanks, Fahim. And so let's talk about what gets covered in the system design interview and what are the types of questions that candidates are going to expect to see?
So questions are mostly open-ended, and the questions are usually related to designing a web scale service. And you're expected to get the information from the interviewer on what service are you building? How many number of users would the service should serve in total per day, per month, at peak times? And then you have to show the ability to understand the components that are going to be used to build a successful scalable system. And we have some of the core components, or as we call them, building blocks, that you really need to understand are distributed cache, search, logging, blob storage, relational storage, key value stores. And you have these building blocks just like Lego pieces. And you would use these building blocks to build more scalable systems. So on one end, you need to understand what each of these building blocks do. And on the other end, you need to understand how you're going to use these building blocks in the right configuration to get the scalable service that you're aiming to build.
Okay, thanks. And so, I think you have like a limited amount of time in these interviews. So typically what, 45 minutes to an hour. Yep. And, how should people, kind of like approach that? So I think, when I've interviewed, I've always kind of like gotten very, sometimes very nervous and sweaty palms. Mm-hmm. So, kind of like how should people, think about like, and prepare for that in the interview?
It's a very good question. So yes, you only have 45 minutes, and actually you have 35 minutes because some of the time will be spent in some icebreakers, and typically interviewers want to leave some time at the end for the candidate to ask any questions. So you actually end up with 30 to 35 minutes. And you cannot really design a Netflix-like system or a Google search-like system in 35 minutes. So the best approach is to get the requirements, then build a very high-level design, a big black box, where each one of those building blocks is not defined. It is just described as a big black box. And then using those building blocks, then expand on one or two of them in the later half of the interview. Your interviewer doesn't have the time to dive deep into all of the different aspects of your system, So typically you would end up talking about only one or two of them in depth, and that's it. So don't try to rabbit hole on one system or one subcomponent in the beginning. First, design the whole system at a very high level, and then dive deeper into one or two of those components.
Got it. And so it sounds like, the questions are really meant to kind of not only quiz your understanding of like, these are the components of a system, but also perhaps like your thought process around design as well.
Oh, yes, of course. Like it's a very open-ended question, and typically there are no right answers. Every answer is the right answer if you can justify why you're using this component or why you're using this certain approach. And as you go further into the interview, some of those things will change. Why? Because you and your interviewer are having a dialogue, and in that dialogue, you're also realizing more requirements or understanding more nuances. And based on your more enhanced understanding, you're going to modify your earlier design to accommodate those requirements.
Got it. Okay. And then another common question that we've seen on our social media is that, what's expected of junior versus senior candidates? How do the questions vary? How does that interview vary between the two?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because some companies don't even ask system design questions from their junior candidates, and some other companies do. But for senior candidates, almost every company asks system design questions. For junior candidates, where you would encounter these questions, it's mostly looking for your aptitude. It's mostly looking for your overall understanding of how these systems work and how these big components interact with each other. And your interviewers understand that you're early in your career, you probably don't have a lot of experience building those systems, so you won't be able to go in a lot of depth And you'll be okay if you can describe the overall architecture and the interactions between the subcomponents in your system. Now, for a senior engineer, the more senior you are, as we have already talked about this is your level settler interview. So the more senior you are, the more defined your approach has to be. And it has to show your practical experience in some cases. And in some cases, when you don't have the practical experience, you have to show very thorough understanding of how these systems work. The more senior you are, if you're like a partner level engineer, then you would even encounter questions around how this system will work with like different compliance requirements like GDPR, or how would you make sure that the reputation of the system is in a healthy state in front of users. But for like mid-level to senior level engineers, you would have to describe not only the high-level design, but you also have to describe in depth at least some parts of the subsystem. Otherwise, you would be down-leveled.
Okay. So we've seen a couple of questions come in, and I think they're kind of relevant to this topic. So I've got one question here from, someone who's perhaps like trying to switch like industries within tech. So his question or her question is, how are people who've primarily worked on embedded and desktop software, supposed to tackle these system design interviews, given that they haven't worked on that tech stack, like web or, like building a web scale system?
Mm-hmm. My practical answer is, and I was one of those engineers. So my practical answer is that you would have to ease into a job where building these systems is your primary responsibility. And the reason is that even if you pass the interview, somehow magically you pass the interview, you still have to go and work with a lot of engineers who have many more years of experience. So the approach is that first, you should definitely read a lot. Look at some look at some talks, read some papers, look at the engineering blogs of the companies that you're trying to get into, and then at least build a overall understanding. The worst part is that kind of understanding requires at least a few months to internalize. You can't just take a course or read a book and then say that I've become a distributed engineer. Yeah, you definitely have to read blogs, you have to take courses, you have to listen to the talks, but it would still take a few months for you to internalize. And I think that's the best approach. It's not perfect, I know. And obviously, if you're competing against an engineer who has real world experience building those systems, you are at a disadvantage. But this disadvantage can be mitigated by you deliberately working towards building your knowledge and internalizing that knowledge, and not just focus on rote memorizing some of the buzz keywords.
Okay, great. And let's take one more question, and this is more around for leadership type roles. And this person asks, how are system design interviews relevant for leadership roles? This person was asked to take a coding interview for a leadership role, and any insights on how the system design interview plays a role for a senior role. I think you kind of covered that a little bit, but it sounds like this is actually more important perhaps than the coding interview for a
definitely for leadership roles. And the question isn't clear, but I'll answer it from both angles. If you're talking about a individual contributor kind of leadership role, like an architect role, then system design interview is the decider. Because you're not going to write a whole lot of code yourself, but you're going to lead a lot of other engineers in designing and building these systems. So your knowledge has to be top notch. And yes, you would be asked some coding interview questions because people want to know that you can write code, and at least you can do code reviews, or you can fix small bugs here and there when there is a need. Now, if by leadership you meant an engineering manager, it's slightly different. A lot of companies ask coding questions from engineering manager candidates, but they don't really care if you even if you're okay in those, because the expectation is that you might not have been coding for a few years, so you would be rusty, and that is baked into the expectation. So even if you perform relatively poorly on the coding part, you would still be okay. But then again, coming back to the system design interview, you have to really ace that part, because you're going to lead a team of engineers and manage those engineers, and the success of their careers depends on your ability to guide them and nudge them in the right direction in designing those systems. So absolutely, yes, you need to understand the nuances of building large scale systems, even if you're interviewing for an engineering manager role.
Okay, thanks, Fahim. So why don't we keep going? If you please keep the questions coming in the questions tab in Zoom. These are great questions. But let's move on to the system design interview challenge. So I think you mentioned that most of the time, these interviews are not about necessarily like exclusively what you know and like spit out memorization. So let's talk about what that challenge looks like.
Yes, they're absolutely not about you memorizing a bunch of stuff. They're about getting a vague statement, like design Uber or design Yelp. It's very vague if you think about it. Then using the first 5 to 10 minutes of the interview in understanding what is the interviewer really looking for when they say design Twitter or design Google search. And once you have established what those requirements are, then you're going to design a system and propose a system based on those requirements. And then as you go and have further dialogues with the interviewer, you're going to understand more about the problem, or you're going to uncover more about the scalability bottlenecks, and then you're going to propose solutions to that. We do have an approach and the acronym is RESHADED, and that's a good acronym to remember in your head during the interview. And I would recommend most people to kind of like follow this pattern and try to cover almost all of the different aspects in the system design interview. We call it RESHADED so that you can remember it, and it's on the screen as well, but I'll just like go through that. RESHADED means that you have to get the requirements, you have to get the estimates. And this is where this is the first part. You're building a very different service if you are serving 1 million users. You're building a very different service if you're serving 100 million users simultaneously. You're building a different service like Twitter if the primary thing that you're going to serve is text, versus your requirements and your solution will change drastically if you are building a service like YouTube or Netflix, which can suck up all the bandwidth that you have. So based on those estimates, you're going to propose a storage schema. And that storage schema will again go back to the building blocks. You would need things like key value stores. You would need blob stores. You may also need our relational databases for some of the operations. And so you would provide a storage schema. And based on all of that, you will be able to propose a high-level design. And that's the first part. That's every engineer has to do, whether you are a senior engineer or a junior engineer. And once you have the high-level system on the whiteboard or on the paper, that gives you the foundation on which the rest of your interview will evolve. But put the high-level design as soon as you can on the whiteboard. Once you have the high-level design, the next part is to understand the interaction between the different components in this design. And that's where your APIs come in. And once you have defined the APIs in the RESHADED pattern, then you're going to like have a more detailed design. And that detailed design is more or less where you will end up in terms of designing the system. And then the conversation will move into the evaluation phase where you're evaluating different pros and cons of different approaches. You're evaluating whether if the requirements change, whether you would need to change the system or what are the potential bottlenecks in the current design and what future changes you may want to make as your system evolves. And at the end, we have this like distinctive component feature thing at the end of RESHADED, which is there because some designs require very specific nuanced components. Like, for example, designing Uber requires understanding of quad trees. And that's a very distinct feature. That's not going to be very important if you are building a Google search engine. But if you're building a Google search engine, you may have to build a reverse index, which is very specific to building a search engine. So every design, in addition to all of those building blocks and all of those very common components, has something distinct. And you have to at least talk about it a little bit in your interview so that your interviewer understands that you can think on your feet and come up with a solution that can be viable.
Okay.
So yeah, remember RESHADED.
Yep. So let's actually kind of take this RESHADED approach and apply it. So you mentioned that in these interviews, I mean, these are typically you got a whiteboard that you're going to be working on. And so, you're collected the requirements from the interviewer, and then now it's time to actually start with a high level design. And so, can you walk us through I think when we were generating this diagram here to show an example, walk us through kind of your approach on this high level design, and then next we will cover kind of the detailed design, kind of the next level down.
So yeah, what you're seeing on the screen would be more or less the design that I would have in the first go as a high level design if I'm designing Uber, because this is the basic interactions. You need a database and some servers to store some state and make a connection between the drivers and the passengers, and they're talking to you through an app, and that's it. That's your basic design. And as you're building the high-level design, you will expand on what are the different components that would be expected to solve this problem. So let's look at the low-level design. The detailed design as well.
Okay.
Of the same problem. Yeah. So now the detailed design has more things. It has a payment service, and it has ETAs, and it has a little bit more interaction between how the request ride API works. And of course, this design still is a little bit vague on how databases work. And at the stage, your interviewer may start asking more questions about how would you store the data? How would you store the driver data? How would you store the ride data? How would you log this? How would you make a connection if the driver goes offline? And that will, so that part of the interview will then move into that evaluation phase where you are justifying the decisions that you have taken, and you're also explaining why the decisions that you have taken will help you achieve the system that you were aiming to design.
Okay, thanks. So we've got a couple questions that have come in, and maybe why don't we take those? And I think, a couple folks have been kind of asking what some more questions about what to expect. So
sure.
One question from, I believe it's Adil. So in the system design interview, should people be focusing their learning and preparation on concepts like fault tolerance, scaling, load balancing, et cetera, or things that are, say, specific to a specific cloud platform like AWS, Google Cloud Platform, or Azure? Because it says sometimes the interviewer is more interested in Nginx config and AWS knowledge. So, what are your thoughts?
It depends on different companies and different interviewers. You're right that some interviewers in some teams would want you to hit the ground running. And if they have Nginx, or if they have a certain AWS configuration or a certain Terraform file, they would want you to understand those components very well, and they would ask questions around that. And this is very similar to some companies will ask you a standard problem solving question, and they won't care if you solve it in Java or JavaScript or C++, versus other companies will ask you very Java specific or Spring Boot specific questions, which are related to the stack they're using, and they want someone to hit the ground running. It depends on the kind of companies that you're interviewing for, and unfortunately, it also depends on the interviewer that's in front of you. I would say for FAANG, most people keep it more general. So talking about generally about load balancers, talking generally about storage systems is better than talking about specific components. And here's the funny part. A lot of these interviewers may not have the understanding of a certain company-specific stack. For example, if they've been using AWS, they might not even know about what's in Azure, and vice versa is also true. So your best bet is to at least understand that if you're going to say S3, you also can say a scalable blob store, and then you can use them interchangeably. And based on what's resonating with your interviewer more, you can gravitate towards one approach or the other. But I would still start preparing from more generalized ideas and then become more specific, unless you already have experience working in one of those stacks, and then it would come more naturally to you anyway.
Okay, cool. And then one other question here. So this person is asking questions around like designing YouTube, Twitter, Yelp, and Uber. Are they, it's a almost a rhetorical question. Is it that easy to design? Like realistically, designing systems that large really comes to, those opportunities are few and far between. And so it's like, why are these questions being asked?
The questions are being asked to evaluate how you would perform how you would do in your job or perform in your job as you start understanding more and more requirements about a certain system, and how can you take the feedback and then justify the design that you have on the paper. And I know it's a little unfair. Like a lot of people like me, when I interviewed, for my first interview in Azure, I did not have any system design experience. I had only built desktop apps before, but I was still asked some of those questions. And fortunately, as a junior engineer, you only have to show aptitude and some basic knowledge. And of course, as you grow as a senior engineer, the bar is higher because you're going to land in an org and work with other engineers who would expect you to perform at that level. Otherwise, you would become the bottleneck. So that's why they ask these questions. And again, I would say the goal is not to really design the system. The goal is to show your ability and aptitude to understand the requirements and then articulate a solution, understand the modifications or understand the more nuanced requirements, and propose the modifications that would help you build that system. And if you're having this two-way dialogue, your interviewer can judge the ability that, hey, even in the real job, when we are having a conversation like this, I can work with this person. And he and I can riff off on different ideas, and we can come up with a good solution quickly. And that's what they're looking for.
Okay, great. So I've seen there are a couple other questions that have asked about, how do you actually start getting some experience with system design, either, as the next step in their career as for applied experience, or, as maybe earlier in your career, and to prep for, some of these interviews where, you're still going to be primarily a software engineer. So let's talk about, how to actually get some real world experience with system design.
Yeah. So I would say the first thing is that if you're in a job, and especially if you are in a job where you're working in some small part of a big distributed system, because that's usually going to be the reality, that you may be working in one of the ad orgs in a big Google ad org, which is part of the search org. I would say the biggest thing that you can do, or the best thing that you can do, is to zoom out and start understanding the bigger architecture. Yes, you still have to be an expert in what you're building, but it still helps if you can start zooming out and start understanding the interactions between different components, how my component interacts with storage, how the storage interacts with load balancers, how this interacts with search indexes. So start understanding this. Also, very important, even as a junior engineer in a job, when some decision is made, especially when some architectural decision is made, try to understand what's the justification. Why did senior engineers or architects in your team or other teams gravitated towards a certain solution? What parameters they were looking at, what bottlenecks they were anticipating, what trade-offs were they making? Because a lot of system design interview and a lot of system design in real life is about trade-offs. If there was one standard solution that will make perfect distributed systems, then we would all adopt it. And then we all won't have to go through this. But every system is different based on the trade-offs. So try to understand the trade-offs, even if you don't understand how the solution works. And thirdly, I would say start reading blogs. A lot of companies have published a lot of great stuff. And of course, we have published courses that Steve and I will talk about at the end. Take those courses. They take a very grounds-up approach by first talking in deep about the foundational pieces, the building blocks, and then we take those building blocks and design bigger and bigger systems. So yeah, so study. If you're in a job, zoom out and keep reading technical blogs.
Okay. And I do want to point out that in the second bullet point, you should not be reading the docs. You should be reading the docs. There's a typo in there that was my fault. So
yep, read the docs.
Yeah, read the docs. Yeah, and proofread the deck before the webinar.
Testing.
There you go.
Unit test, man.
So a couple more questions have come in. So someone's asking, like, do you feel like it's necessary to read the papers like GFS, Colossus, Spanner, or DynamoDB for system design interviews? Or do you feel like that's a little bit too specific?
If you're interviewing for E5, maybe E6, probably not. If you're interviewing for a very senior level, you don't need to read the papers, but you need to understand the overall architecture. In their blogs and courses, we have one of those courses as well, that explains those papers in more understandable language. So you should have the idea. And why is that important for senior engineers? For junior engineers, we've already said no. You don't really need to read those papers or understand those systems in detail. For senior engineers, because a lot of their responsibility is to design systems, and they would suck at their job if they cannot get inspiration from what has already been built. If they have to reinvent every wheel, why did Google build Colossus when they already had GFS? You can read those learnings, you can understand those learnings, and then apply those learnings in the designs that you're making today, instead of making the same mistakes and reinventing the wheel. So as a senior engineer, you need to understand the history and the transition of why Amazon built Dynamo and why Facebook built Cassandra looking at Dynamo, and then why Twitter built Manhattan based off of Cassandra. At some point, Cassandra stopped working for Twitter and they had to build Manhattan. And if you're designing a system that is hitting the same constraints, then it's better if you read it from someone else's mistakes than making these multi-year mistakes on your own. And that's why it becomes important for senior engineers. I hope this answers the question.
Yeah. And I think the slight nuance of this question is that's come in is, how do are there variations in the system design interview for someone who's interviewing for, say, like a data engineering position versus a software engineering position?
Absolutely, yes. The data engineer will be grilled a little bit more on how they would create like scalable pipelines, and that would be a more data-oriented interview in how would you be able to ingest data from a lot of different resources, how you would be able to sanitize the data at scale. So based on the job, scalability, based on the job, your interview will be tweaked a little bit, because scalability is a problem anywhere. If you're a software engineer, you're solving scalability for handling millions of users or hundreds of millions of users. If you are a data engineer, you're solving the problem of the insane amount of like data, telemetry that's being generated, and how can you ingest and get insights from the data is a scalability problem. So yeah, so it will change a little bit, but the foundational pieces will still stay the same. Like you still need large scale file systems and large scale blob stores to store data. You still need to ingest a lot of data quickly and index it for searching, etc. So a lot of the building blocks will still stay the same, even though the end result and the product that you're going to build is going to be different.
Okay, great. And we've got several other questions that kind of lead into this next topic is, resources for getting ready for that system design interview. So a lot of folks have asked, like, what's a great learning path for that? How do I get started? What do I need to know? And these range from entry level, mid level to leadership type of roles.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do have several courses. This is just a sampling of how to prepare for the entire interview loop. So we did a prior webinar, I think a month or two ago, on coding interview patterns. So these are understanding like different algorithms and patterns you're going to be expected to know during the coding interview. And we've got this available in 5 different languages. And then we've got a great course. I think one of our most popular courses is grokking the modern system design interview for engineers and managers. So it goes into a lot more depth. It talks about like these different design scenarios, like how would you design Yelp, Google Maps, Uber, tiny URL, and things like that. And then also like low-level design using object-oriented principles. And then one thing that we haven't really talked much about is the behavioral interview. So this is probably the least technical interview you're going to have to go through in an interview loop, but it is an essential interview where they're going to assess your cultural fit. So we will provide links to all these courses that we have, in addition to like over 600 other courses on like core topics like Docker, Terraform, programming languages, data science, machine learning, and a lot of other topics that have come up in this Q&A. So a lot of great resources are going to be coming your way in your email within the next couple of hours. And before we wrap things up, let me go ahead and see if there are any other questions that have come in at the last minute and that we might want to wrap up with. Let's see. So I guess this is actually a good question, and this is around APIs. So, how often, do APIs and required like hands-on knowledge or design principles for APIs or, come up in the system design interview?
That's a very good question. And I think that it's slightly different than the system design interview, but very related. So when you go for an interview, either your interview will be focused on the infrastructure and the backend parts of the design, or it will be focused on the interaction among these different components. So it might take a more API-driven route, or it may take a more backend/infrastructure route. And I think that we should absolutely create a new course on API design, and that's a good cue for us to like come up with the API design course as well, because understandably, a lot of people are asking for it, and REST and POST and GraphQL, they're all creating these different challenges that are not really covered in the classic system design interviews, and yet they are being asked now more than ever in these interviews.
Okay, so we're going to wrap things up. Thanks again for joining, and have a great day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Bye.
If you enjoyed this video, help us out by liking and subscribing, and tell us in the comments if you want us to explore any other languages or topics. Come visit us at educative.io, where we have over 600 courses spanning programming languages, web development, data science, and system design and interview prep that provide pre-built dev environments that let you code directly in the browser so you don't have to configure anything. Thanks for listening, and maybe check out one of these videos next. Thanks.